Okay, well, I just want to welcome everyone to the IRIS webinar today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Andy Frisetto. I'm an employee at the IRIS headquarters office in Washington, D.C. And our speaker today is Lucy Jones, who is joining us from the USGS in Pasadena, California. Just to remind everyone of sort of how the webinar works, what we'll do is when I finish the introduction, I'll hand this over to Lucy. She'll talk for 40 to 45 minutes, sort of a typical colloquium length talk. And during that, if you have any questions that arise for the speaker, then you can use, there's a questions panel on the webinar control panel that's floating around on your desktop. And you can use that to write a question that will go to me. And then at the end of the talk, I will address Lucy. I'll let her know who asked the question and what the question was, and then she can respond to each of you individually. That's a little bit easier than unmuting or remuting everybody. It can get a little chaotic. So I would just ask that if you can make your questions clear and concise, that'll be very helpful. And this happened on the last webinar where we had a hiccup with the connection and everybody got disconnected. So in the unlikely event that that happens again, just come back to the webinar and we'll be able to reboot it very quickly. I don't think it'll happen, but I didn't think it would happen last time. And then after this is finished, and if there's something that you want to review again later on, or if somebody you know missed the talk and wants to see it, then this is being recorded as we speak, and it'll be archived and posted through our webinar page, which is here on the left side of the screen. And so we have all the previous webinars that have been given are posted here, and then there's a little coming soon list so you can see what's on the horizon. And we'll update that as we get talk titles and stuff like that. I just want to also add that the webinar that we're giving today is sponsored by our Early Career Investigators Working Group. That's a group of several members of the community and myself at IRIS that are interested in uh, reducing the energy barrier for young people coming up into the sciences. And so the aspect that this webinar is addressing, it will be about ways to communicate with the public as a scientist. So if you have any interest in that, the page is on the right side here with information about that program. And if you're interested in knowing more about it, feel free to email me or some of the other working group members. So I think without further ado, I will kick it over to you, Lucy. And just to introduce our speaker today, Lucy Jones is a seismologist at the USGS in Pasadena. She's also a visiting researcher at the Caltech Seismo Lab, and she is the science advisor for risk reduction at the USGS. So, Lucy, thank you for joining us, and I will send it over so that you can show your screen.
Very good. Do I need to accept or does it just?
It should, yeah, it'll should give you that option.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to bring this up now. Let me know. You should be seeing a full screen of my presentation at this point. What I'm going to be talking about is a cooperative project that I've been getting into with a professor of communications. I, of course, have had a lot of experience in talking with the public specifically about earthquakes. And I'm going to say that what I'm talking about is as much the natural hazards science communication rather than really broadly all of science. My experience has been often being one of the people that gets thrown up to the media when we have earthquakes here in Southern California. We've also, being in Los Angeles in that media market, we're often turned to when there are international events as well. And I essentially had developed some empirical relationships of things that worked and things that didn't in handling those situations, and have been having a fascinating time discovering how, in fact, there is quite a significant research field on exactly the topic of risk communication. And in the schools of communication, that's a very large part of it. And so I've been partnering with a guy named Tim Sell now. He's a professor and dean of the College of Communication at the University of Kentucky. Did a lot of work with the CDC, with Homeland Security on communicating during crisis situations. and started to realize that, in fact, they've done a lot of research that really fits with essentially my empirical evidence. So I'm going to be trying to go over those topics today. Um, I want to start for one thing about why are we going to be up there in the first place to help us understand, why we want to be listening to this. Um, in that crisis communication situation, we are probably trying to get people to undertake a certain type of behavior. We need to share this risk with you because we want you to be doing something about it. We also want to be educating people about science, and those are not necessarily conflicting objectives, but they're sure not the same objective. Um, and why are we wanting to educate about science? Part of it is for the goodness of humankind. There's also the very reasonable desire to showcase our own work, to be able to show what it is that we've gotten done, why somebody should care about it, because we want to tell our story, and in the long run, that's a very good background to being able to do successful proposals. So, when you go to hear Greg Anderson next week tell you about NSF, they like to know that you've been successful and look good. But in earthquakes are rather a special situation in that the public comes to us because they really want something from us. And this is true really with all the natural disasters. As I said, I'm going to focus on earthquakes because it's what I know. But they not only want something from us, they actually need something from us. People are turning to us with rather significant psychological subdemands in this situation. They're scared and they want us to do something about it. And it was coming to understand that that was really what's driving a lot of this immediate post-earthquake communication that helped me evolve how I go about doing it. In this talk, I want to let you know about the field of risk perception, this whole psychological area where they've been studying how people look at this stuff. Understand this issue of what's the role we're playing in society during earthquake crises and what people are trying to get out of the scientists. Also, give a bit of understanding of what drives the media. A journalist really is not like a scientist. It's not a scientist who writes more. They're coming from a very different perspective, and it's important to understand it if you want to communicate effectively. And then take this to explore how you go about developing better messages and being more effective communicators of what it is that we want to say. I'm going to do this from three different perspectives. One is this sort of, I say that what's the probability that your listener actually understands probabilities? The psychology research that has looked at how people hear and react to messages, both of probability but also of risk. And I think it's pretty important for us to understand. I'm also going to use a couple of other situations, looking at what's happened after, immediately during disasters, right after big earthquakes, so we can see what it is that people are wanting there, and how it's not necessarily the time when you want to get out there and really explain your science, in spite of the very big temptation that you've got everybody's attention. And then I'm also going to look at what's happened with the Great Shakeout. Of course, it began here as a solely Southern California project. It's now expanded around the country. It's been quite successful. And I think a chunk of that is because we actually listened to the social sciences scientists at the beginning of devising the project. And I want to share some of those insights with you. You can see how it's made a difference and how people hear our information. And then end up with some ideas about how you go about creating your own message and what to do if you're put in the position of being asked to respond to the media. Okay, let's start out with this risk perception area. So this is next few slides are going to be all mostly from my colleague Tim Selnow. When you're in this position of doing risk and crisis communication, you need to understand. The good messages have to understand what's the emotional response that's going on. People are not thinking logically in these time periods. We're trying to provide the ability for the people who listen to us to make informed decisions. We have information that we know will help others do a better job of making decisions during the crisis, and we'd like them to not only get the information, but have ownership of the information so that they actually use it in their own responses. And both of those are leading towards, we really don't want people to be running outside during earthquakes and being hit by the facade as it comes down. We want to be able to convince people to take constructive responses. Um, Earthquakes is a special sort of situation here too. You can put this straight one out, but most of the positive things you can do, you should have done before the earthquake hit. So it's a place where we need to look at what happens in the crisis and what we can do at other times as well. Okay, so how do people perceive risk? You know, us seismologists think these maps are a really good way of doing it. Um, in fact, we have a large percentage of our population that doesn't know how to read a map. We have a larger percentage of the population that doesn't know how to process a probability, and relatively small amount of the population that can actually take these sorts of maps and turn it into what it means for them. So um, when we look at what the field, the communications and psychology research have shown, they've been able to demonstrate that there are several factors beyond the actual probability that influence how people perceive a risk. So that if something is involuntary, it is considered much worse and more dangerous than something they have a choice about. The classic example is people are more afraid of flying in an airplane than driving a car, even though the car per mile is going to kill a lot more people. They have the illusion that they're in control when they hold the steering wheel. When they give it over to somebody else and they don't have any interaction with it, so there's some pilot they have to trust, it tends to make things worse. Um, Another thing that makes things seem perceived as more risky is having it be unknown to science. If the message is, we don't know why this happened, people are much more afraid of it than if we can say, we understand what's going on. This is the influenza virus and it acts in this way. And yeah, it still kills 35,000 people a year. People are a lot less afraid of the flu than they are of the earthquake, which is, even though you're far more likely to die from the flu, but it's this, they feel like it's unknown. Um, and the fact that earthquakes cannot be predicted helps contribute to that feeling. So even though volcanoes tend to be more dangerous than earthquakes, they can be predicted. The earthquakes can't, and that makes a big difference. Um, how bad the outcome is. If the outcome's really bad, people focus on that and have less input to the probability. So how, whether it can be catastrophic, it's not just a couple of people being affected, it's really affecting a lot, that increases the fear and the perception. The dreadedness of the outcome, you know, if the idea of being trapped in a downed building and the fire coming through, it's just such an awful image, it makes the earthquakes feel worse. And if there's a certainty that fatal, you know, you can be killed out of it, there's that makes it worse as well. Look at every one of these. Earthquakes come out pretty much at the top of the list. I didn't add one here actually that makes it worse that we don't have, which is if somebody did it to you. If it's intentional, it's even more awful. And therefore terrorism at even lower probability levels gets such a high level of response from our country, the fact that somebody's doing it to you. And I find it rather interesting to look at what's been going on in Italy and trying to make it be that somebody was doing it to you is a way of, I think, targeting anger from it. But earthquakes just sort of hit all of our big touch points so that we perceive them as being a bigger danger than they actually are. Another factor that affects a lot of people is what they call numeracy. This is, probably most of you know about this. It's the numerical equivalent of literacy, with the ability of people to handle numbers and think them through. And an interesting thing is they've done research on how people look at numbers. It's not a matter of intelligence. There are plenty of very intelligent people that just don't process numbers. You probably aren't in this group, since by being at this webinar, you're almost undoubtedly a scientist. And I think it makes it difficult for those of us who have a high numeracy level to understand what goes on. It looks stupid. And it's pretty important to recognize that it's not, and separate out these issues. And what they found is that the less numerate people are much, well, it's actually not big surprise. They don't listen to probabilities even more than the more numerate people. Duh. But it also means that the affective considerations, which is, the emotional impact, have a much bigger sway when you aren't processing the numbers to affect it. And once again, this hits the earthquake pretty highly because they often have a very strong emotional component, the suddenness, the uncertainty, etc. And then there is a bit of a flip side that they say that us highly numerate individuals, uh, less susceptible to framing effects, meaning we don't use the emotions around the situation to come up with the action, but then we'll often get overthinking it and often end up in a situation with the more numerate, literate people. Um, you're saying 5%? That's a 95% chance it won't happen. I don't have to listen to you. And so there's a possibility of not getting the complete picture because you overdo the numbers. Um, Another factor that I find one of the most interesting things, and sorry, we got a bunch of boring slides here, but that's what I get from the psychologist, an interesting perspective. Um, I had always thought that saying 1 in 10 and 10% was the same thing. And of course, mathematically, it absolutely is. What they have shown with testing of people's response to messages is that if you say out of 100 situations, 10 times we ended up like this, or if you do this 10 times, one of the times you're going to have an earthquake following, or if you say there's a 10% chance of having an aftershock following, the 1 in 10 is heard as being, it's perceived as a greater risk. And this is not a function of numeracy. Highly numerate people have exactly the same reaction. And when they actually quantify how people respond to these risk messages, there isn't a difference in whether or not people understand the probabilities. And they think that what it is that when you say this 1 in 10 times we're going to have this, you're focusing on that one time. By saying 10%, you give it more of a focus on all the times it doesn't happen. They think that that's what's going on, but it's a very strong and it's a consistent result over all of the psychological testing that they do. So if you want people to listen to you and take it seriously, use frequencies instead of probabilities. And I will say that I had gotten the feeling that people heard them differently, so I would often use both. So when I would talk about foreshock probabilities, I'd say, well, there's a 5% chance that this will be followed. That means if we have it, 20 times like this, we'll have it happen once. Because people hear them differently, putting both of them in there actually is probably more confusing. And since I've been talking to the psychologist, I've now stepped away and I try to not use probabilities whenever I can. Another research piece that comes up is that when we sort of touched on it before, when the outcome is really bad, people ignore the probability and just focus on it being really bad. So when you talk about, a nuclear weapon and you're terrorist, the fact that it's so highly improbable, people are still putting a huge amount of effort into trying to prevent that from happening because of the awfulness of the outcome. And you'll see this, that when we're talking about the chance of a magnitude 5 in California, people realize that isn't such a big deal. When we talk about what the big San Andreas earthquake is like, they ignore what the probabilities are. Of course, in that situation, the probabilities are relatively high, so it doesn't matter. So sort of summing up what it is, you need to remember that people you're talking to are not engineers, and they may be very intelligent and really not get probabilities whatsoever. If at all possible, use frequency instead of probability. People hear it more concretely, but they also are much more likely to perceive it. And then you don't have to get into trying to explain why, when sometimes becomes 10 times more likely, you've now gone from 10% probability to 60% probability, or whatever the calculation would work out to be. Then you're really going to lose your listeners if you get into that. So frequency is usually a much better way to do it. And the badness of what you're talking about are really going to affect how people listen to you. Okay, so now I've got another little section that I got from Tim Selno, where looking at how risk communication messages get reported through the media. So whatever it is that you're trying to say, how on average the media pick it up, that you should be aware of, because this is how it's going to get interpreted after you do it. And they have then this urgent communications lab, and they have software to track and analyze all of the different messages through a wide variety of the news sources. And they have ways of picking up whatever the topics are. I guess it's basically a Google News approach. And then they've been able to go through and do analysis of how this is perceived, or what the different parts of the messages are. So here's an example from one of the situations where they had, almost 1,000, or it's 500-600 articles, media articles, or news pieces about a particular event, and then looking at what the focus of the story was. And you can see that the favorite thing the media likes to do is to blame somebody. And in fact, if you sum up denial or blame shifting, blame and wrongdoing, you got a very large percentage of what our stories are about. And usually with earthquakes, it's harder to do, but they'll find a way. And the shift of the stories towards, was the building owner, who skimped on the building codes, or what we're seeing in Italy now, this is the way the media carries the messages, and it's something you're always going to have to be aware of, that's going to be trying to go on behind whatever it is you're talking about. The other thing, though, is that one of the important things is to have instructional, well, let me go back. So instruction self-help. If you're hearing a story about something going bad, if the message includes something you can do about it, people have a lot less fear. And I'll get to a little more later about that, but it's a very important part of the messages. If you're going to say what a problem is, say what you can do about it, or you're just increasing fear and increasing uncertainty. So one of the other things they did is look at which part of the messages actually had instruction in there and who they got it from. This is actually a case of tainted egg, salmonella poisoning. Notice that 3/4 of it ended up being provided by the news broadcaster rather than any sort of expert. This is not the best situation, because they're going to say what they think is right, but they aren't in any way trained about it. Why do we end up in this situation? Well, Tim handed me this graph of this is the way it goes. I'll tell you why I think this is. And it's because we have, as scientists, we often have such a difficult message in being, a difficult time in being concise and straightforward about what we're saying. And when the news media goes to do a story, especially if it's well, this is all broadcast. When you've got it in broadcast, they've got significant time constraints. Your total story is going to be 2 minutes long, and they need to have a succinct statement. And if you've loaded it up with the qualifiers that you would obviously do whenever you're giving a scientific talk, as my colleagues X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, and F have said, when we published in this source, we found that this, with the qualifier of this, ignoring this other type of situation. The media can't use that message because it's too long. If they're lucky, they can chop off your acknowledgments of your colleagues and still use your message. If you didn't give them quite enough space between doing that, they can't use it. And then they have to paraphrase what you said, because they just don't have time for all of that other stuff. And it's a difficult thing for scientists, and I know scientists that still really don't want to accept that you don't get to give those acknowledgments, that it's going to offend the colleagues. This isn't, especially in a crisis situation, who are you serving here? Are you trying to make sure that your colleagues aren't mad at you for ignoring what their contribution, or are you trying to get out some instruction that might help somebody respond to this event? And you've got to think about in those situations, because the long sentences, and actually the way I've just been talking here, that would not be usable. You need to have, the perfect soundbite is about 15 words. It's not very long, but they're, and so And you don't want to leave something off, but the more succinct you can make it, the more likely it is they're going to use it. Okay. Here's another interesting piece that they've been able to test in these psychology labs is the problem of over reassurance. I mean, we already said that it's when it's unknown, when it's uncertain, that's when people are really afraid. And that's really clear. Confusion and fear rise highly with the uncertainty. So the temptation as somebody being asked for information is to provide that certainty. Right? Well, we actually have two temptations. Especially in the food tainting sort of things, you'll see people providing strong reassurances. When they're then proved wrong, this is a complete backfire where they actually it causes them a lot more problems, and that's what are showing in the next couple of slides. So here's the TV coverage of the story about whether or not we had H1N1 vaccine available, and the blue line are the storages about the shortage. And because they spent all the time at the beginning telling them how you were going to have the vaccine, don't worry, it's going to be here, we're going to take care of this, when in fact they couldn't get the vaccine done, then they had a whole series of stories about how they couldn't get it done. And very, very negative coverage then on the stories that was not encouraging good behavior, that was looking very bad on the CDC, because they were too optimistic at the beginning. This is another example of contaminated peanuts with salmonella. And you see there's a peak in the story back in June when they first discovered the problem of the contaminated food. And at that time, they said, don't worry, this isn't in all of these other sorts of products. Well, months later, it turns out it was in fact in those other products. And you get even more stories coming along later about how the supposedly clean products were in fact contaminated. So this is a very repeated thing, that if you are proved wrong in your reassurance, it absolutely backfires and really undermines your credibility. Now, as scientists, these are obviously coming from, not necessarily from scientists, from spokesmen for companies, from government emergency managers, and you give your information to an emergency manager, you got to watch what they're saying. There's another Italian reference that we could put in here. The scientists actually said there's a 3% chance of there being a big earthquake. It was the emergency managers who took the information and turned it into a statement. Don't worry, go back and have a glass of wine. So, and yet you can't be out there, the whole thing of contradicting the emergency managers would be a great increase in uncertainty. There would be a story about the arguments going on, and again, reducing, increasing the fear in the population by doing that. As scientists, we often, though, are in a position where we talk all about the uncertainty. That's what our jobs are. That's what science research is living with the unknown. And we, know and love that whole process of sitting and exploring what we don't understand. And there's a real and a good desire to share understanding of the scientific method with non-scientists. That's why, the whole thing of not understanding the process of the scientific method is part of why we're getting, such lack of understanding of what scientists actually understand. The whole climate change, the evolution, all of this is partly not understanding the method. But the method is about uncertainty. And if you're really exploring that at the time of a crisis, you're going to be contributing to the fear. So it's one of the hardest balances to take, is where do you show your certainty, where do you show your uncertainty, and how to communicate it. And when it's a crisis communication is really different than the other times. One last piece on this, though, it's an interesting thing. It's another example where confidence went down when they were talking about a terrorist, information about a terrorist attack that had reduced confidence in how government was handling it. But once the crisis passed, people went back to feeling the same about the different agencies. So this increase in uncertainty is very damaging at the time, but isn't necessarily a long-term damage to your reputation. All right, I've been spending quite a bit of time here going talking about this, what's different in the crisis situation. And I want to just take a little example right now to help emphasize this. I mean, when I don't know if you've ever thought about it. It took me about 10 years to think about this. When we have an earthquake and we're really excited. We run into work, we're studying what happens, and all the reporters show up and want to ask about the earthquake. And, I tended to think that they were just as excited about that cool fault offset as I was. And, this is just such cool science. And I'd get excited. They're like, are you crazy? Um, and then, maybe they want to talk about the damage and the impact on society. Eventually they do, but really not right at the beginning. And I'm going to now go out of my PowerPoint and show you a small clip. It's off a YouTube video that was a, a day after the Northridge earthquake. And there had just been an aftershock. And in fact, that it was actually it was about 24 hours later. There had been, felt aftershocks every few minutes. There had been quite a big one earlier more in the morning, and then on almost a 5, and then there had been some smaller one, and they were waiting to hear. And they were sort of like, you can see that this is live news footage. You can barely see the picture, but it's dust clouds coming off of the San Gabriel Mountains because of the shaking. So this is within a minute or so of the earthquake happening. And at that point, this is 1994, we didn't have, earthquake notification system, it's an odd thing to remember. The Northridge earthquake happened before HTML was released. So it was before there was any sort of visual web. We did have email. And then, so they had to come over to Caltech to get the information, but just listen to what they're saying online.
I tell you, it is interesting to watch people's reactions when you have an aftershock like that one. You and I kind of stiffened here in our chairs.
What happens?
People are just on eggshells right now. They really are. And anything, any movement at all of the earth, and it comes right back to you. Oh, was that a bigger one? What is it?
You immediately reach out to the person sitting next to you. I can't tell you how many times that happened.
I like holding your hand. Thank you.
Right? I like holding your hand. These people are actually really quite scared, and they didn't mind showing that they were scared because it was reached that point. And the aftershocks are part of that process of not letting people forget. And it was about this time I started to really understand that what's happening on the day of the earthquake is a need to reestablish normality, right? You've just had everything change out. You don't know what's going on. I don't know how many of you have, actually been in a big earthquake. The lights go out. You might have things being thrown around the room. It can be extremely terrifying, and you don't know what's going on. And the great interest now in the USGS earthquake web pages, right? They're by far the most visited government web pages in the whole US government. And it's because it's a way of trying to understand what's happening during the event. And when they come to the scientist, we give it a name, we give it a number, we give it a fault, and we're saying somebody understands this, and it makes it less frightening. Actually, in the Northridge earthquake, when it happened on a buried fault, we never named the fault. We said that a name of a fault implies a relationship to a geographic feature. It doesn't come to the surface. So we'll just call it the fault that produced the Northridge earthquake. It doesn't have a name because it's not mappable. It was a big mistake. It really upset people that we didn't know the fault. It emphasized what we didn't know and contributed to the fear. The most extreme case of that was, as we were talking about that, I remember explaining it in one press conference with Kerry C. Actually, he was here at Caltech then, and came up with it. And there was one reporter that said, "But how many unknown faults are there?" Right? You really wonder how that guy's making a decision about earthquake insurance. But we made a mistake with that. And I think in the future, we try now actually very hard to agree upon a name very early and to try and figure out the fault as fast as we can and to stay consistent with how we do it. One of the other things that happened with Northridge, we ended up in an argument about which sort of structures it might be involved. Again, and that went, was it covered in the press? It's what you do scientifically. but it conveyed the message that we didn't know what was going on and wasn't the best advantage at that time. And we didn't get people then understanding our science. They just got scared. And I think if that debate had happened in the press 2 weeks later, it would have been okay. It would have, people would have understood this is how we go about doing it. But in these few, especially that first day, they're really dealing with a lot of other things. So this is sort of my summary of what I think needs to be done in as our help for the community in that immediate after math of an earthquake. This applies to something like a volcano as well. Right? People are trying to reduce their fear, and when we redefine normal, we say this is something that's understood. It helps them manage their fear. They also want to understand what's coming because, again, it's the unpredictability. So this is where I've ended up getting involved in doing aftershock probabilities. I'm now in this partnership with the communications professors to try to figure out how we can phrase aftershock probability messages that will emphasize what's understood and not be such an emphasis of the, yes, it's a stochastic random process. That's not what we need to emphasize in how we're talking with non-scientists. The other thing is the concrete actions to help the response. Those all make it much more manageable for people. And just as I've said a couple of times, it's not the time for the scientific method because people need to not be focusing on what is not known. And one other point I want to make about this that I've really noticed in doing interviews, I'll get back to it a bit later, but the reporter often comes in and wants to get you talking. So he asks you a question. And you might think that he actually wants the answer to that question because most of the people we talk want the question they asked answered. That's not really the case with the reporter. He's throwing out a bait to try and get you started and see whether he can come up with something that'll make a good soundbite. And so it's very important to understand he might not know what he's asking. And I've seen it over and over again where a reporter asks a question that is pretty weird and you have to get in pretty convoluted corners to get down to what he's asking about. And maybe that wasn't intended at all. He thought he was asking you, what fault it was on. And think carefully about what question he should have asked before you go too far down the line of answering the question he did ask, because it might not be something that we really want to be talking about at that time. Going back now to some of the psychological research, they've also done testing of different types of messages again, in a crisis situation. And if you actually are wanting people to do something about your information, they've been able to show that there are really 3 things that need to be in the message for this to happen. You need to first make it personal. You've got to let the person internalize it. Am I affected? Why does this matter to me? Right? Or that it clearly doesn't. We are talking about earthquakes that are happening in Los Angeles today. Okay, that affects you. But they need to understand how it relates to them. The interesting thing, though, is they also need to understand why. And a message that doesn't have the science that says why this is happening isn't believed. This is good news for us as scientists. It means that what we do is really important in these situations, and people really need to be working with us to get messages that'll work. But if we just have, this really matters to you, and this is why it's really bad, but not what you can do about it, you're increasing the fear. So having actions for self-protection are another really big point about it. And I think that that's to the degree that what we are doing is trying to help the community deal with earthquakes. When we are doing that type of education, it is incredibly important that we partner with our emergency manager colleagues and make sure that we're giving appropriate actions without letting them take it over and turn it into saying something that isn't true. So it's always that balance. And turns out, in fact, I think the next one, actually a little bit of testing. I would have thought the psychologists would do better graphs, but I got this from them instead. Um, that when they did a testing group of over 200 people and looked at different types of messages, there was a statistical significance of like 99% that when they had all three pieces, they felt that they were going to be more efficient at protecting themselves. And very, very clear that leaving out any one of those pieces reduces the impact of the messages. Oh, in fact, they actually had information about what the reaction was. So if you only have the explanation of it and why it matters to you without the instruction on what to do about it, you actually had diminished confidence in being able to handle it, increased fear. If you were told what to do about it and why it mattered, but it didn't relate to you, it was indifferent. It didn't change any behavior. It's only when you put all three of them together that you got the knowledge, the actual increased knowledge and confidence to act on it. Okay, as we're wrapping up, I guess I need to wrap up a bit more quicker. I want to just take a moment to look at Shakeout and what happened with that to see how using some of the psychological information can make a difference. When we started setting out the Shakeout in the first year back in 2008, it was all for Southern California. We set our goals. We wanted to get 5 million people to participate. We were laughing about it. We didn't think we'd get anywhere close. We actually got 5.5 million, so pretty well blown away. What we were doing, though, is we were trying to shift the culture in Southern California about earthquakes. We wanted to change how people reacted to them, which was basically to ignore them. We wanted to get people talking about it and understanding that they have a personal responsibility. You know, the tendency is to think that you handle earthquakes by doing building codes and it's something government does for you. So we wanted to try and get people to take personal responsibility for their own earthquake safety. We did it we talked with the social scientists and we came up with 4 explicit tactics based on the social science of how people respond. One of them was to engage in consistent messaging. We formed the Earthquake Country Alliance, which was basically everybody who was working on earthquakes, the scientists, the emergency managers, the Red Cross, and any businesses that wanted to participate, fire departments, so that we all agreed to speak with one voice. And this is because the social scientists say that if you have the same message coming from multiple sources, it's more believable. If you have multiple sources giving different information, you decrease the believability of all of them. So we formed the alliance. We agreed to focus on drop, cover, hold on, not because it's the most important thing to do, but because it was one consistent message to start it off with. And we did add this take one more step. Drop, cover, hold on, and then do one more thing to make yourself safe. And we also went out through multiple media. We got partners to buy us advertisings, etc. But the first step was to make sure we spoke with multiple agencies speaking with one voice. The second thing was to develop a visual reinforcement. And we did this by making it a media event. I mean, Shamu was a little extreme. We've been able to get an astonishing level of partnership on this. And this is because the social science says that people do what they see other people doing. That's like fashion, right? The visual part is apparently a big reinforcement for a lot of people. And how do you get people to see someone preparing for an earthquake? Well, we came up with these media events, but also that's another part of the drop, cover, hold on drill. That's seeing people preparing for earthquakes. And then hopefully you can extrapolate that to other things as well. The third tactic was what was called encouraging milling. Milling is the process by which people talk about something with other people they know and other people they care about. And to make a decision to take an action, most people require going through this milling process, exchanging information with people they care about. And so an explicit part of the drill was having it happen in all the different locations on the same day. Plenty of people did earthquake drills before Shakeout. But we wanted to have the daycare center, all the different businesses, the schools, the colleges, all having a drill at the same time. And then the idea would be that the children come home from school and say, Mommy, we had an earthquake drill today. And oh, I had one at work today too. And Daddy says, I had one too. And you start having a family conversation. The first year we explicitly did it right before Thanksgiving, hoping that people would be then hope maybe it would last long enough for them to talk about it at their Thanksgiving meals. But this was an explicit attempt to encourage people to discuss it with others, not in the professional community. Talk with their friends, with their family. And then the fourth one, back to this whole thing of perceived risk is not the big determinant on how people respond. We focused on, rather than talking about what the earthquake probability was, we focused on the outcomes and what you could do to prevent that. So that was all of those were explicit steps. I won't go into it now, but shakeouts turned out to be really successful. We had 19 million people participate in 2012. So these tactics seem to really be working. All right, let me wrap up now with applying it to how we actually do some of our own messaging. How do we actually go about and do this? Want to point out that it is worth it to you to learn how to do this, because if you can explain your own work in your own words, you can get attention for your organization. If you're able to communicate effectively, the cameras will show you and not the reporter. They really do want to have the expert talking and not them. The fact that it's 75% of the time it's them doing the talking means that they couldn't get a succinct statement out of their experts. And it's the way in the long run in which we're going to keep our science supported. We need to be visible as doing something for the good of society to keep society wanting to pay for it. But we've got a rather big challenge in that scientists and journalists think in really different ways. When we write a paper, we start with introduction, with the data and methods, with techniques. You don't get results till you're halfway through your paper, right? And then little bit of discussion, as my thesis advisor always used to say, was 9 pages of data for each page of what he called BS, which was what he called his discussion section. But that's the way we approach it. We make sure that we really are there, and we don't give the result till we've backed it all up, because we know that our colleagues are going to go and jump at us if we haven't justified it first. Journalists, it's really the opposite. They start, you go read a newspaper article, they have to have the main news in the first paragraph. They start with the results, and then they say why it matters to you, and then the end of the article is all the background for somebody who actually wants to get down to reading to it. And it really is an opposite way of looking at what you're doing. When the media come out there, they're only going to do a story if it actually is considered news. And the things that make it news are not necessarily really connected to what we do as scientists. New results, yes. Local impacts, maybe, maybe not. Timely, maybe, maybe not. Notice that it's news when it's conflict and controversy. That's not when it's science, right? Our science result is when we've stopped having conflict. Conflict's what we do every day as we go through our peer review, okay? And that's a really fundamental difference. And if you really look at all of these things and lay them out, with science, we start with evidence. Journalism, you start with your conclusion. We spend months, right? We're people who think that 6 months alone in front of a computer terminal working on one thing is a great way to spend your life. The media has to get it done in the next hour, right? We also live with uncertainty. We know that's where we find the truth. They demand certainty, but they don't really believe that it ever exists. There's always another side of the story, right? And that it's a very different perspective. We live with uncertainty to find the truth. They start from certainty, but don't even accept that there's truth underneath it, right? And of course, rational versus emotional and who you're writing for. But I do think that the bottom line, to me, the most important, is that for us, the story's in the consensus, and for a journalist, the story's in the conflict. A good science reporter understands that, and understands that the real story is when you've got the scientists of differing opinions coming together on the same result. But most journalists are not science journalists, and it's where you're most likely to run into a problem with them, right? So what do you do when you go into this? There's some other things that I think it's pretty important to be able to stand up against these guys. One thing and I think it's the most important, you need to know what your message is. You don't want to be giving their story. You need to know what yours is. And you need to answer the question that they should have asked. Right? Now, if you're too far away from the question, they'll come back to you and get it in another way. But, watch a politician. They completely ignore the question that's being asked and say what they want to say. We don't want to go that far, but we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that they know more about the subject than they do. They are sending out a fishing expedition, and it's your job to direct them in the right direction and get the message out that should be there. But the other points, if you recite from memory or if you read your text, they are not going to be using that on the broadcast because it will be too stilted. And maybe that means you're not going to be on the broadcast. And this is different when you're talking with a news media. You, of course, don't have to worry about this. You do have to worry about answering tough questions and making sure you get your message out. But you need to feel empowered that you're in control of the interview and not them, and go into it knowing what it is that you want them to say. I'm going to take off, sort of end with this point. I'm going to take us out of this again to look at one rather dramatic example of doing this that I was quite impressed with. It's from the director of the USGS, our present one, Marcia McNutt. Oops, no, I want this one. It was right after the Chilean earthquake, and CBS decided that between Haiti and Chile, this must mean that the United States was going to have an earthquake. They decided the story was the big earthquake's coming. So let's look at how she handled that.
That devastated Haiti earlier this year was 7.0, which makes the massive 8.8 quake in Chile about 500 times stronger. So is this quake activity something Americans should be concerned about? Back here, joining us now is Dr. Marcia McNutt, Director of the U.S. Geological Survey. Good morning.
Good morning, Harry.
It is interesting because of information technology. We know about quakes as they happen all over the planet. We have one happen in Haiti, very close by. Chile is not so far away. Is the big one headed our way?
Well, Harry, it's really not a matter of if, but when a major earthquake strikes the people of the United States. And we have to use these earthquakes as learning moments to better prepare the people of the United States for such a catastrophe. And every time one of these earthquakes happens to our neighbors, we do learn something. And as tragic as these events are, and our hearts go out to the people of Haiti as well as to the people of Chile, we are learning a lot from both of these events.
So notice, she was asked, does this mean the big one's coming? And she turned it into an answer about how important it is to do science to study the earthquakes and to understand that we need to be prepared. And yet she sounded responsive, but she sure didn't answer his question. It was just wonderful watching that be done. So just to leave it out, know that they're looking for comfort from you. They're wanting to hear that someone understands it. They want to have certainty, which we should do if we are certain. And again, answer the question that they should have asked and focus on what we know. I'll end on this one point. I've watched this happen way too often. The reporter shows up and says, so what did we learn about this earthquake? What did we learn from this earthquake? And the scientist responds with what was different. And that's what's interesting us at the time, right? So Northridge happens, and we spend all our time talking about the damage to the welds and the steel buildings because we'd never seen that before. We did not talk about all of the absolutely predictable damage, that 95% of what happened we knew before the earthquake happened was going to happen. And so we gave a message that we had no idea why damage happens and look at how surprised we were, instead of the very real message that almost all of the damage is completely predictable and absolutely preventable. So I think we need to make sure that when we're in these situations, we talk about what we do know rather than focus only on what we don't. We spend our time in the uncertainty and in that research, and it's why we're the scientists, but it's not necessarily the message that people should be having during this time period. And again, wait for recovery to talk about the new science. There is a window when people are no longer so scared, but they haven't yet forgotten what's going on, where we can talk about our science, we can share the scientific method, we can talk about uncertainty, share our excitement, because that's going to convince some other kids to come in and be scientists too. But just don't do it when people are really afraid. So thank you, and thanks for your attention. Hope it was survivable through all of this process. And uh, Andy, maybe we can hand it back to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Lucy. It was a great talk, and we have a few questions from people. I would encourage everyone else out there, if you have a question and you haven't submitted it yet, while I'll go through the first few that I have, feel free to submit one. I'll get started. You sort of closed on this, so I'll bring up this question first. This is from Luciana Astes. And she's asking, when do you think it is the appropriate time to use media access as a teachable moment? A day or two after an event, or later than that? Is there sort of a window or a threshold for this?
Well, I think it depends on the size of the earthquake, right? It depends on how scared they are. And so I think with, uh, Whittier Narrows, it probably happened in about 2 or 3 days. Because then we had the big aftershock 3.5 days later. We had to get it through that. Once we were like the day past the big aftershock, we were fine. Northridge was probably 1 to 2 weeks. Definitely not in the first 3 or 4 days. Landers, it was interesting. Of course, there was a lot less damage, but there was where we were afraid, right? We actually had the fault coming down to the San Andreas, and people were really picking up on that. And I guess as long as there are rumors, as long as there are really active rumors that there's going to be another earthquake and we're not sharing it to avoid the panic, that shows people are still in a really scared stage. But on the biggest earthquakes, I think we're probably looking at a week or two after it, when things have started to settle back down. And there's still, we still had lots of news coverage for a year in that time period.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Next question is from Joan Latchman. Joan submitted this question a little bit earlier in the talk when you were talking about frequency versus probability. And so her question is, in trying to get people to be prepared for earthquakes, how useful is it to provide frequency or probability? Might that not be counterproductive?
It depends on what your frequency levels are. And, I think it is a challenge in Virginia, without question, and even in Utah. If you're really saying this is a once every 200-300 year event, that's a harder sell. In California, uh, I think it does help, but I don't think this is personal opinion. I actually want to do get involved with Tim on getting some direct research on this topic. My impression is that when we go and say, we give 30-year probabilities, and then we give them in terms of years. So this is from 2003 to 2033. That then people and then people come along in 2012 and say, well, the probability by 2033 is this number, and the probabilities are so confusing. I think in California, where we can say, Southern California averages 7 magnitude sevens per century, about 1 every 15 years. That's a high enough number that I think it does help people. To the degree they don't confuse it, I'll actually admit that when I discuss the Southern San Andreas, I sometimes sort of play games, because I don't think we know what overdue means, right? I think there's a reasonable case to be made that the probabilities don't go up with time that much. But let me tell you that if you say, well, however you want to calculate the probabilities, the fact is we've averaged 150 years between earthquakes, and it's been 300 since the last one. That's a compelling message, and people listen to it. I actually consider it, I use it, but I realize that I'm probably playing on people's misinterpretation of what overdue means. So it's I think it depends on whether or not it feels compelling to you on how often they happen.
Okay. There's a follow-on question as you were making your answer to the first question from Suzanne O'Connell, and she asks, or she starts saying, "You say use frequency and not probability, but I thought you also said 1 in 10 is perceived as a greater risk than 10%." So her question is, or I guess it's another comment, but I thought we didn't want to make people afraid.
Um, well, yeah, that's actually it's not a it's that's not a bad point. And what is it that we're trying to achieve by doing it? And actually, I guess I've dealt with this by what I did with the shakeout, where there we were looking by doing the shakeout scenario, we looked at impacts, made it very concrete, got people really scared, and then said, but here's what you do about it. Come and participate in this. And we tried to make the shakeout be fun. And I think that if the shakeout focused on being scary, we wouldn't be having this participation. And trying to focus on it being fun and a community engagement event, I think is important. But it is a good point. Do we want to make it seem more concrete when people are already uh, more afraid than the risks actually present? Um, you've got to decide what it is you're trying to communicate and trying to do in the times in which you're doing it.
Okay. Uh, there's a question from Jorge Montalvo, and his it's a comment leading into a question. It was not really clear to me how we can avoid over reassurance when we deal with such uncertainty with certain events. I am a master's student in volcanology, and I get people all the time asking me when a certain volcano will erupt, and I answer, I don't know. They look at me as I did not know anything. So how do you suggest we avoid that over reassurance with the large uncertainty?
Yeah. Um, One of the things is to focus on the difference between what happens at the crisis and what happens on the long run. And I, when I get asked when's the next earthquake going to be all the time, and well, actually, what I usually respond is with a joke and say, if I could tell you that, I'd be a lot richer than I am. Um, but I think you explain that they go dormant for a long time, but you can recognize the times when they're getting active, and then you can start making assessments. One thing is to try and provide a little more information, because the other piece of this is the science behind it is a good thing, right? I think to me, it was the most encouraging thing I saw out of the psychology is that if you just say it's going to be at this time and here's what you do about it, that doesn't help people. They need to understand why you say it. So, and that's when they can be interested in what the science says. So we can't. When I say don't do the science at the time of the event, I'm not saying don't talk about scientific results. I'm saying don't focus on the uncertainty of the scientific method and be talking about how we're exploring these new things. I think that's the biggest problem. Right after the earthquake, we're doing a lot of important science. And what's exciting us at that point is what we don't know. And that's where the real danger lies, rather than the results of the science or being able to explain why we know a part of it, and even explain why we don't know. The volcano can just sit there for a really long time, and what we look for is the time when the magma starts moving. Trying to find relatively simple ways of describing the limits to what we do and don't know, I think is helpful, where people do want that information. What they don't want is the waiting around and the uncertainty and the unknown, which is why a lot of people are not scientists. Scientists are people who are comfortable with uncertainty. Most people aren't. Anyway.
Okay, great. I have a question from Tina Neal at the USGS in Alaska, and
Yeah.
she was wondering if you could share what your personal approach is towards earthquake safety, as an example. So, how are you prepared for the next event?
Tina, you want to get me? I get reporters asking me to come over to my house and see what I do, and we always turn that down. Um, um, and actually, but my approach is balance. And so we do on the preparedness levels, recognizing it could happen at all times. I I really do things like try to make sure I never go all the way to empty on my gas tank so that I can, that I won't run out of gas because there won't be gas pumped after an earthquake. I do make sure that I try when I try to do supplies, I try to do it in maintainable ways because if I go put a supply kit and put it in a corner, I'll ignore it for 10 years and it'll be useless when the time comes. So we do things like try to knock it down to what few canned foods we use. We try to make sure it's there. Um, we do maintain water supplies. Um, we have rechargeable flashlights that we leave plugged in at all times so that we don't have to depend on the batteries still being able to work. But far more importantly is the personal management of the physical safety. So when you know, we bought a house, we one of the things we do within the first 6 months is uh, get the foundation specialist in to come in and make sure that it's properly secure. All the bookshelves in my office are hooked to the wall. Um, when we moved home, we made sure that we put the bookshelves to the wall for in the boys' room. For the rest of us, it was a bit later, but for the kids, we made sure it happened. So it's really about living with it, and that's what I try to share with people when I get asked about it. Um, and it's, of course, I'm living in a place where earthquakes really are a reasonable risk, and it needs to be part of daily life.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Ronald Schott, and he's wondering how is the advent of direct broadcast media, for example, YouTube, Twitter, other websites like that, changed the USGS's communication philosophy? And by that he means direct as in unfiltered by the media.
Oh, I wish it had. We don't. We're a government bureaucracy. We aren't very nimble at responding to this stuff. So, I think it's a big challenge for us. And in terms of a local earthquake, remember I said our last significant earthquake was before HTML was released. So we really don't know how that's going to be handled in this situation here in California. I mean, there is, of course, a pretty big effort at NEIC to track social media. And they're actually doing filters off of Twitter feeds to try and be able to locate earthquakes with it, which is pretty cool. And in a sense, it showed up as early warning, if you will, for, that the people were getting Twitter feeds in New York before the waves from Virginia arrived there, which is pretty amazing. Um, but I think, in fact, it's a challenge for government agencies that our media response is, it takes a long time for us to shift, and things really are shifting on this. We are, however, I will say, planning some meetings with NOAA to at a relatively high level to share some information about, sort of how are we, how what are our experiences, and should we be trying to shift things. I'm trying to encourage it that we should coordinate with NOAA because of this issue of being consistent in our messaging.
Okay, great. There's a question from Lorraine Wolf, and she's wondering, can you comment on the differences of communicating risk in stable continental areas like for example, the New Madrid seismic zone?
Um, Not real, to be honest. I feel like I shouldn't because my experience is here in California where I am comfortable telling people that the big San Andreas earthquake is bad enough and likely enough. It really should be a high priority in your life. And I think the stable continental areas are more of a challenge. We were talking about trying to get earthquake messaging in St. Louis with a foundation in the Midwest. And St. Louis has got a lot of problems. And should they be spending their money on earthquake issues instead of, you know, housing and whatever other social thing, or flooding? Excuse me. Like, don't deal with your earthquake before you deal with your flood. This is as they're building some huge mall in a floodplain, and so it is more difficult, and you have to focus on a longer time frame. Mostly what I've been talking about here has really been the short-term crisis response rather than more of those long-term messages. And I think the challenge is how to reflect that the low probability, well, this is sort of a fundamental issue for everyone. As scientists, we know that it's inevitable, but by inevitable we mean, that's New Madrid earthquake's got to happen in the next 1,000 years. That's not most other people's definition of inevitable. Inevitable means before they're dead. And and that's that fundamental geologic time issue, I think, is one way the way I deal with it is by talking about it explicitly and pointing this out to people, and that it comes up over and over again in all the geologic hazards, and I don't feel like I've really solved that question, but I do think that the more you can be explicit about time frames, and it's not a question of if, as Marcia said, it's not a question of if but when. The problem is that when can easily exceed your lifetime.
Okay, great. Lucy, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't keeping you or anything. I have a few more questions queued up here. I just want to make sure that.
I can do. I have my next thing's at 1:30, so I have another 15 minutes.
Okay, great. So there's a couple more open-ended questions. So I don't know how much you want to commit to these, but I do want to at least ask them. There's a question from Eleonora Rivalta, and she was asking if you could comment a little bit more about what happened in Italy with the L'Aquila case.
Yeah, I did mention it a couple of times. I mean, as much as I understand it, I mean, it sounds. I can imagine having been in a similar situation, to be honest. I mean, there was the real need to deal with. I mean, there were predictions being made by that radon monitor guy that the earthquake's going to happen tonight, and it didn't happen. The earthquake's going to happen this week, and it didn't happen. But they were causing a lot of fear. And so the commission was convened to try to deal with the fear that was being developed off of these really wrong predictions. When you look at what happened, you read the report, it does say about 3% of these types of swarms end up in big earthquakes, which was really the number at the time. Nobody read the report. They listened to what the emergency manager said on TV. And that's what was really being taken on. So there's lots of lessons, I think, for all of us as we go through this. There's that you need to be, need to be careful who your partners are and how you say it. And I think there is a thing that the scientists, it's pretty hard to imagine getting up there and saying, well, that's what was said, but you were wrong. You got to somehow have done it beforehand. And I don't think they wanted to tackle the emergency managers who were out there trying to squash the reports about the radon stuff. And we once were in a situation where we gave the California Earthquake Prediction Evaluation Council was saying there's a 1 to 5% chance of the San Andreas earthquake today. And because there had been a swarm right at the southern end of the fault. And CalEMA said, oh, thank you. And we're like, okay, where's the public statement? They said, oh, we're not going to do it. And we ended up never going and doing a public statement from the scientists. If that earthquake had happened, we would have been in just the same position as what the Italians were. So I know how you get there. And I think that our only defense against that is to be absolutely and completely open about everything we're doing. The most common rumor I hear is that we know that there's an earthquake coming and we're not saying anything to avoid a panic. And we can't stop it completely, but we can be sure that we're always sharing whatever information we can. And so the USGS is committed now. We're in a project working with, and this project with Tim Selnow was part of it, to create a system for doing public statements about aftershock probabilities on whatever sort of swarm situation or earthquake or aftershocks might be showing up. We're trying to cover all the situations we can think of and work with emergency managers beforehand on what we should say in those situations. But then we're going to go out and publicly say it immediately through the web without going through them and all of the delay that that involves. We'll get it agreed to ahead of time. And I think that that's the best defense for us. I think the other part, when you look at it, is that you've got a community that's really angry at how the earthquake was handled. This isn't just about whether or not it's predicted. It's also about the fact that 3 years later, they're still sitting with the rubble in that city. And the poor handling of a disaster has brought down a lot of governments over time. If you look at what happened to Somoza with the Nicaraguan earthquake, or the Gang of Four with the Tangshan earthquake, there's a lot of situations, or the Republicans in the House after Katrina, badly handling a disaster. It's the one time everyone wants government to be competent, and if you're not competent, then they question you in a lot of other ways. So that's another emotional side of the disasters, and I think that this is the lashing out of a community that really is angry about being abandoned in this situation too.
Okay, thank you. There's another more open question, and this is from Derek Shutt, asking if you would care to speculate why scientific messaging related to climate change has been so poorly received. And he comments, it seemed like a great example where scientists have been ineffective in getting the message across.
Yeah, it's a big enough one that I probably shouldn't get too deep in the weeds on it. I'm interested in it a lot. And part of it I think, is this aspect of the difference between scientists and non-scientists about uncertainty and what that means. We understand that when we talk about the uncertainty, we're being honest about the limits of our knowledge. To the non-scientist, that becomes evidence that we don't know what we're talking about. And rather than, I think we got to focus on what we're doing with climate change, but I do think this is part of a very significant societal question, that we are not empowering the non-scientists in the basics of logical reasoning. You could call it scientific method, but a lot of it really is just logical reasoning. And I think we treat science education as a way of finding the people who are going to be scientists and ignoring the rest. And we need to make science education a process by which everyone comes to understand how to analyze data, how to believe something. You need that to handle reading through the internet. And look at what's happened to our society with people believing whatever they read in some of these places. It's a fundamental problem, and I do see climate change as tied more to that fundamental understanding of what science and the scientific process is.
Okay, great. And I think, depending on how long it takes you to answer this one, this might be our last question. This is from David Calvo, and he's wondering, how do you proceed when there's no living memory of an event? And by that he means you had the opportunity with the Northridge earthquake to react to something that was very tangible, and maybe other earthquakes in that sense. But in his case, with volcanoes, how would you proceed when you've had no eruptions in the last century? And then he says people get comfortable, or people used to get comfortable with the no news is good news philosophy. How do you approach them?
Well, that gets back to this whole geologic time thing. It's all around that same theme. And even though we had Northridge wasn't that bad an earthquake, right? It killed 35 people. It's not what San Francisco went through in 1906. And one of the ways, well, the way I dealt with it was creating the shakeout and the shakeout scenario, trying to really, instead of focusing on the probabilities and the uncertainty and what we don't know about when that earthquake's going to happen. Vanessa, what we say, we don't predict earthquakes because we don't predict the time. We predict everything else about them. Prediction is what science is. So we focused on predicting what the impacts would be and just sort of not worrying too much about what the probabilities were and making it more concrete for people. And we have been able to get people to engage. I don't want to sound too smug, but Shakeout has changed things in Southern California. We have people really, Southern California Edison has spent more than $20 million analyzing the impact of the Shakeout earthquake on their system after they saw what we've done. We have a big effort going on now with Los Angeles Department of Water and Power retrofitting the water systems coming across the fault. And those are very specifically because of Shakeout and really making concrete those impacts. When we started our multi-hazards project, we got told they wanted us to do, we asked the emergency managers what they wanted, and they said they wanted scenarios. And my first thought was, oh, damn, why did I say I'd do whatever they said? I mean, I was like, it seems so boring. Really trying to really work out a plausible consequence turned out to be pretty interesting science and has had way more impact than I ever imagined. And I think that this is sort of about remembering that not all our users are engineers. Probabilities are good for engineers designing buildings who've already accepted that it's an issue. For other types of decision makers who are less numerate and have and don't have the living memory, helping them understand what we're talking about, focusing on those concrete consequences, are the ones that help them manage it.
Great. Well, I think we'll stop it here just so you can get to your next meeting, Lucy. Don't want to make you late. But this was really wonderful. I think this is one of our best attended webinars. Great questions from the audience and a very engaging talk from you. So let me just offer my thanks for you taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been fun to do.
Yeah, our pleasure. So yeah, just everyone have a great rest of the week. I will finish recording this, archive it, and it'll be up on our webinar page in a couple days. So if you have other people you think might be interested, you can send it along. And with that, thanks again, Lucy, and thanks again, everyone else out there, and everyone take care.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.